And we are live. We are live. Yay. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome back, everybody, to the Life Matters podcast. My name is Keyonna Monroe. You know who I am. We all know Miss Belle and all of her goodness and sweetness. And we have a very special guest, a second time coming on because we had an interview. I had an interview with Mr. Dr. Edward Addison, I think it was like a year or two ago, and it was really, really good. And we've been talking about popping back on for a while, and I was finally able to pin him down with his busy schedule and get him on board. Welcome.
It's a pleasure, absolute pleasure.
Okay, so I'm going to pop into the topic at hand, and it's really, really important. It's kind of like a continuation of about what you and I were talking about the last time we were on the live about negative belief systems and limited belief systems, and how that has a lot to do with, just some of the conditioned programming. And I always say it's really important to kind of develop a level of self-awareness and recognize that negative behavioral habits stem from our belief systems. And it requires a lot of courage and vulnerability as we kind of acknowledge and take responsibility of our actions and see that how, once we identify these negative habits, that we challenge the underlying beliefs that, fuel them. And a lot of it is based off of conditioned programming via our environment, via our culture, and some of the things that we were taught growing up. Um, let's start with you, Edward. What do you think? What's your opinion on where these negative belief systems kind of stem from, and how does it show up in the day-to-day life of people? And is it via conditioning? Or is it just something that most people kind of, it's like in their head?
I think when we think about it, I always say that we somehow come into the world as blank computers, and although yes, within our various DNAs there are things that we are individually susceptible to. Some might put it down to genealogy, some might put it down to genetics. Um, But then when you put that person within a certain environment, you then have a combination of the environment, for example, and I'm going to give some examples here, the environment that the person's in, plus their propensity in terms of their genetics to garner different thoughts or negative thoughts. Um, there's the study, sort of study of where you perhaps even take twins and put them in different environments, and their thinking will be totally different, even though they both look exactly the same or are identical twins. And so we find out that so often a person doesn't have to be a slave to their environment or to where they're brought up. There are many people who find it within themselves to rise above that by virtue of learning or education or reading or role model indeed in that environment that lifts them above the environment that they're in. But you tend to have this general sense that um, certain people within certain environments have a propensity, and that might sound like a degree of generalization to think a particular way. I remember a particular program which I listened to years ago about the private schools in the UK here,
Mhm.
and I watched it with an immense amount of personal intrigue, having gone to private school here, but also to witness the history of the private schools in the UK and how over the years they had taken certain young men out of the wider society, put them in a cocooned environment, and and got them to start thinking a particular way. But there was a particular sentence that the narrator mentioned, or indeed one of the principals of the private school passed across and said something to the effect that one of the reasons why we set up these individual private schools was that we wanted to raise the finest English gentlemen who we could send across the world, who could think like the imperial empire and colonize the world. And so, for example, although the British, if you know, Great Britain is an island, it's not getting any bigger. If anything, it's getting smaller by the erosion, if we might say that. But imagine a small island like England having the capacity to colonize the whole world in such a way that English is perhaps the most spoken language across the world in many countries. And so it shows that when you put people within a particular environment, you can start to get them to think a particular way. And then
Mm,
now you imagine that whole context of what we call culture, a culture, either a culture within a society, a culture within a group of people, a culture within a company. It's a culture really, it's a particular way of behaving that emanates out of a particular way of thinking. And so when you've got a particular way of thinking, it affects how people behave. And so you can develop a culture, you can change a culture, you can, but if you do nothing about it, um, things flow in a direction of the least resistance. And so people's thinking becomes, if I might use this colloquialism, stinking thinking when they're not deliberate or give thought to how they are thinking. So let me leave it as that at the moment.
Bel, what do you think about that? What do you think on the topic?
I agree. I agree a lot of what he just said, especially around culture. I think um, it is true. Just having people, grouping people together and getting people to think the same way, and then they create this culture. Um, I think it's true. When you're talking about colonialism, it's true for me. For example, I'm Ghanaian, but I grew up in Austria, and when I moved back to Ghana, I realized how culturally, even though I'm both parents, heritage, Ghanaian, fully Ghanaian, not mixed, but because I had spent the majority of my childhood years in a different culture, I moved back and experienced culture shock, even
Mm,
though I'm going back into what should be my culture. So I really do think that you pick up um, thought patterns and belief systems and even the way we speak, not just in terms of um, how we articulate, but even the way what we speak about, what we confess, is all influenced by where we put, who we surround ourselves with. And that really affects our belief systems and um, shapes the way we are. So 100% agree. I really love some of the thoughts that he put out there.
yeah, I agree. I think environment and all that has a lot to do with it. And I think we as, you know, a a community, especially us as Black people, we sometimes have a lot of limited beliefs because we were told for such a long time of the things that we can't do, or things that are not for us. And I always take this like little scripture out of the Bible where, when Adam was like naked and Eve was naked and they were hiding and they had all of this fear and they had all of these things that they started to think about that they weren't thinking about before. And God told them, who told you you were naked? Right? Like,
Right.
who told you? So I think that a lot of times, based off of how we grew up, the environment in which we grew up, we tend to create a dialogue for ourselves that, has been negatively imprinted. I think we lost him, but hopefully he'll pop back on. That gets imprinted on us, and we start, having this dialogue and using this language of I can't be this, or I can't do that, or because I'm a woman, I can't, or because I'm a woman, because I'm a woman of color, because whatever the case may be, you start creating all of these limits for yourself. You either believe what society has said and the glass ceiling that they put on you, or you look around in your environment and you say, well, because other people have never done, fill in the blank, that means maybe I can't either. Like, I grew up in South Central LA, and I grew up where I was the first person to graduate college. And also, I didn't really have anybody who was telling me all of the dreams are possible, or the things that I wanted to do.
Or even valid.
Exactly. And then experiencing, all of the trauma that I've experienced as well, you hear a lot of things about what you can't do and what you can't be, what you shouldn't do, what you are incapable of doing, and the limitations that society sets on people of color. You see everybody else doing it, right? And then you take that on for yourself. And it's really hard to unlearn those type of things once they've kind of, systemically been programmed in you. And it requires, like I said, a lot of self-awareness to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to unlearn those things, because I'm going to pay attention to the people who told me I can't, right? And I always say, just because it didn't happen for you, or those things were not successful for you, or those are the things that you couldn't achieve, that is not going to be my story. You
Mm.
know, what it
Mm.
impossible is not impossible for me.
Yeah.
Whatever is possible for me. And it's hard to do that when you could really ruffle some feathers of people who maybe put you in a limited box. Do you know what I mean?
And I think often it's also people who put you in that limited box are often people you love and
Mm,
people who counsel you respect. And I think that's what makes it harder, especially in some of our communities where we are so led by fear that it's
Mm.
the fear is out of love, you know? When I teach on cultures,
Yeah.
they're like different cultural dimensions. And when you look at African cultures, and it's also true for like South American cultures, we are a culture that is shaped by shame and
Mm.
as opposed to say Western cultures, global North cultures that are shaped more by guilt.
mhm.
And when you have that dynamic of your grandmother saying, "Oh, be careful of this," and then your mother saying this, and your auntie saying this, etc., it'd be very, very limiting. And distinguish what
Uh-oh, Belle, you're breaking up a little bit. Belle, you froze. I think the technology is giving us a hard time today. Um, but to kind of piggyback until Belle unfreezes and kind of pops back in, I think that when it comes to, like I said, a lot of negative belief systems and conditioned programming, we have a lot of conditioned programming of unworthiness. And those are deeply ingrained beliefs and patterns. And that way of thinking that makes people feel, inadequate and undeserving and lack of self-worth. And then, it's a result of societal and cultural, personal influences that kind of shape the perception of ourselves. And often it comes from a young age, which leads to somewhat of a distorted self-image and constant feelings of not, being good enough. And conditioned programming of unworthiness, for example, can stem from things such as, like, our childhood experiences, like I said, our environment, societal expectations. You have social media and just regular media influences, and then comparisons to others as like the cultural norms. And this type of programming, it operates on both conscious and subconscious levels, which affects our thoughts, which affects our emotions, our behaviors, and it usually manifests as negative self-talk, and then self-sabotage or perfectionism, or people pleasing out of fear of failure and some forms of rejection. That affects your relationships, that affects, whether you speak up for yourself and ask for the things that you want and believe that you are worthy of the things that you are asking for. And a lot of that, when you have limited beliefs and when you have a lot of those conditioned programming of I'm not worthy or I'm not good enough, then you usually seek external validation and approval to compensate for like the perceived unworthiness that you have. And it's a constant need of feeling validated. And we have the tendency to compromise our sense of self and conform and shape shift. I don't know if, anybody else does that, or if you agree with any of that, but, I think that it's really important to have some time to sit with yourself, ask yourself, what's the dialogue that I say to myself? Who told me I was unable to do these things? Who around me do I compare myself to that's not doing the things that I want to do? So I am subconsciously kind of telling myself these are the things that I can't do because of that. Um, and that is really important. I know that I have the tendency to do that a lot of times, and some of my limited belief systems come from the fact that I am the first and in a lot of things in my family, and that I wasn't guided and shown how to do things that were outside of societal norms from the environment in which I grew up from. And it was really hard not to conform and kind of shrink myself into the environment and the experiences that I was involved in growing up. Most of you guys know. If you don't know, once again, I am a child trafficking survivor, and I was in a gang and all of those things. And it's not because I wasn't smart, and it's not because I didn't have any academic success. It's just because I had very low self-esteem, and I wasn't really being poured into, and limited beliefs that trickled down from my family also were kind of sewn into my mindset, right? So I didn't believe in a lot of things because I felt like, well, if my parents didn't do it, or if my grandparents didn't do it, or if so and so didn't do it, no one else is thinking these things and no one else is dreaming these dreams. Why do I feel like I am better than everybody else? So it took a lot of fighting and arguing within myself, that internal dialogue, that forced me to change my outcome. I didn't have all of the steps. I didn't know all of the ways that I could do the things that I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to do it. And instead of trying to control the how, I just made sure I focused on the why. I don't know what happened to Dr. Addison and Bel, but hopefully they'll pop on. I know Bel is out from Ghana, and then Rwanda, and then Edward Addison is popping in from the UK. I don't know. Let me see. Did they pop on? No, but anywho, nanny. So it seems like a couple of you guys are in the chat. Let me know what you think. And do you struggle with negative belief systems? Do you struggle with limited beliefs? Do you feel like it's programming and conditioning that came from family, that came from teachers? That's the really interesting thing is I actually had teachers. Hey, Ron. I had teachers who actually believed in me in ways that, I didn't believe in myself. And I had teachers pour into me. Oh, here's Belle. I had teachers kind of pour into me on the days that I felt like I wasn't good enough and my family wasn't really pouring in those good seeds. So I was lucky enough to have some teachers that believed in me. Bel, I know you got kicked out. I think Dr. Addison got kicked out too, and he's kind of trying to figure out how to come back in. But do you want to finish what it is that you were saying?
Yeah, sorry, I was just saying that often the difficulty is that we, when we come from shame cultures,
Mm,
and shame cultures would also community culture. So we really believe in the collective, the
yeah,
decision making power of the collective.
yeah.
Usually it's much harder because those people that we love and that we admire and whose counsel is really has a lot of weight are the same people um, putting the parameters around us. And it makes it harder to then distinguish what is my own fear
Mm-hmm,
versus the fear of somebody who I love and who is counseling me to not do this or not go here or not um, do X, Y, Z. I remember when I was in my early 20s, I decided to go to South America.
mm-hmm,
And I remember my mom was so stressed about the whole thing. And the lead up to me going was so difficult because she was so full of fear. And I had to sit her down. And her fear was then like, oh, maybe this is like a really bad idea. What am I
mm-hmm,
doing? Whatever, whatever. But again, like I said, I grew up in a very different culture, not an African culture, but I was growing up in a different culture, but with African parents. And
mm-hmm.
she had to come to the point to realize just a few days before I left that she was actually cultivating fear and pushing that on me. And she actually had no reasonable reason to be fearful. There were all these things. It wasn't anything that we were doing that was ridiculously dangerous. I mean, this is before, the days of instant like voice message. So of course, if you're traveling now, it's much easier. You can check in every 5 minutes. You can do FaceTime, etc. It wasn't those days, but
Mhm,
her fear was so unreasonable, and it so held her down that she was so upset that I was doing this trip. And she luckily had like this epiphany a few days before I actually left, so that she could actually bless me to go, because I was also very conscious about going out and looking like you were trying to be a rebel, which I wasn't. I was really just
mhm,
going and working and doing some cool stuff and expanding my life experience. But it was a much bigger expansion than what she did. And I said to her, well, do you remember that when, okay, you were a bit older than I was at this age, but you also left your mom and
right,
moved to a different country, right? And it was like she had to sit back. And I think sometimes in our cultures, we think of all the things that could go wrong, but we forget to reflect on all the good that can come out of the
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
I feel like it's very difficult just learning how to say, this is not my fear, this is inherited fear, or it's imposed fear, and I'm going to move it to the side respectfully, and create my own belief systems.
yeah, I agree. When it comes to that, it like you said, a lot of times some of that stuff that gets planted in you is by people that we love and people that we respect and value. And that's actually a little harder to unlearn, because
Mm,
like if it's your mom, like for example, my mom telling me I was told I was never going to be anything. I was told that I was never
mm,
going to be more than I need to marry wealthy, or I need to marry for a buddy and use my beauty to get ahead, and you know and and even though I was really smart, um but I kind of had like this vibe and this energy from my family that kind of came off like, don't think that you're better than anybody else, or don't think that you're too good. And that's also those seeds are planted that cause like limited belief system and imposter syndrome. Most of the time when we go through imposter syndrome, like in different areas of our lives, that stems from negative belief systems too, and like very
yeah.
limited. And we start fostering those beliefs, and
Mm,
instead of challenging them and saying, well, do I believe that about myself and all of the accomplishments that I have? Does that say that, I'm really, I'm all of these things that other people have said, and maybe I should focus more so on what God thinks about me than anybody else can think about me, because, you know, those things affect our choices. Those things affect our decision making, what we tolerate, what we allow,
Yeah.
what we accept in our relationships, and it negatively impacts the relationship that we have with ourselves and our perception of ourselves when we start to digest those things and take them
Yeah.
for actual truth versus saying, you know what, this person is just projecting something negative that they've never been able to experience. And I am not going to allow that to manipulate my mindset and dictate my choices. I'm going to speak life over myself, and know that I am deserving of the things that I want. And I'm not going to allow, what those people say to negatively influence, and cause me to communicate, um, unworthiness within myself. Yeah, I just
So it's
that
a
part, and we as Black
tough.
women
It's tough.
especially have that as a challenge.
Yeah, it's really tough. And we've talked about mothers, but I think there's also the Black women and fathers where you see a lot of women not understanding their worth
Mhm.
because there wasn't a father figure, and I don't mean biological only. I mean it could be,
Yeah.
but just a father figure
Mhm.
that said, at an age when they needed to hear it, you actually have value as you are. And I think that's a huge, huge issue as well.
Yeah.
When we're looking at how we cultivate our belief systems. I think it's so important for both just to have that motherly voice, but also a father's voice. Different for girls than it is for guys. But just as we're talking about mothers, I was like, yeah, it's also really important that you have that father's voice that says are valued and
Mhm.
you are loved just as you are. And I think you're searching for that validation.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. Dr. Edward Addison, hi.
Oh,
You popping
oh,
in and out, popping in and out. I would love to have you chime in on, culturally as a society when it comes to, Black men and Black women. Um, what are some of the challenges that you think we face, in our society today, and how do we allow other people's limitations to negatively impact, our dreams and what we reach for and what we aspire for?
yeah, I think some of the things and I think we will deal with this as we go along. My sister mentioned it earlier on that when we think within the concepts of our culture, the past generations sometimes have a particular way by which they view things and how things should be done.
Mhm.
And when you're trying to uh, envision thinking outside the box or being an outlier,
Mhm.
you come up against some roadblocks, which are this has never been done before, or this is how you should do it. Um, More recently, I was thinking about the whole context of how we superimpose what a person should be upon them. For
Mhm.
example, in being of Nigerian heritage, we come from families whereby the only three or four professions that were viewed as anything significant were being a medical doctor, being
Mhm.
a lawyer, or an engineer. Such
Mhm.
that even in Nigeria today, oh well, some might add, if you got to be an architect, you just about made it, also. But
Yeah.
anything outside that was seen as almost anathema. I mean, I remember with my boys, um, who are graduating from university now. Um, I took a different approach.
Mhm.
Instead from that, I said, "Oh, what do you want to study?" And I remember my younger son saying, "I'm not too sure yet." He was in his A levels and doing history, philosophy, and economics, and he said he wasn't sure. I asked him some other time, he wasn't sure. Asked his older brother, he wasn't sure. I'm like, well, you'll make up, you'll be sure as you go along. But I was not going to superimpose the values I had or thinking I had upon them becoming something. And Emmanuel, who's the oldest, eventually studied physics and astronomy at the University of Nottingham, and Daniel, who's 28, studied philosophy at Bristol, and now works with the London Stock Exchange as a senior associate architecturist, which means he's a cybersecurity consultant from philosophy. But you understand, so sometimes this superimposition of what's been done before and how it's been done before and why it's been done before upon our own mindset, and we carry that with us. We carry that weight with us in such a way that we begin to view ourselves as failures if we don't do anything else or become anything else outside of that box. And so let's example, I'm talking about an academic box here. And so oh, I didn't study. If a person didn't study medicine or didn't study law or didn't study, they see themselves as less than. And I remember I was in medical school, and there were guys who didn't make it into medical school, who became dentists or who became vet doctors. And those of us who were in medical school, we looked at them like, oh, poor them. They really wanted to become medical doctors. And but maybe they didn't. Maybe they wanted to study vet or dentistry, but we thought they were failed medical doctors that eventually went on to become. And so that whole mindset of a superimposition of what society, what other people think about you, what your parents think you should be, and everything then becomes a mix and messes people up in a way that they no longer become their true self. And becoming your true self is what we're thinking about here. And most recently, I was writing a statement. You know, I do a lot of things leadership related. I was going to post it today or tomorrow, which said, "True leaders think outside the box, are outliers. The best of people who achieve in society." We look at people like the guy who's with Tesla. What's his name?
Elon Musk.
Yeah.
The Maverick, or even Bill Gates. They were at Harvard. He was at Harvard and dropped out. I mean,
Yeah.
in our society, you drop out, you're a failure for life.
Yeah.
You
Mark
know,
Zuckerberg dropped out.
yeah,
Steve
exactly,
Jobs dropped out.
exactly. They all
Yeah.
dropped out. You know, and so that whole context of what is
Yeah.
success? How do we view success? Is it a sheet of paper? Is it a degree? Is it what is success? There are many ways to achieve success in society or to become our true self. You understand, and that's critical. I was watching most recently. I follow a lot of the sports, and I learn a lot from sports. And I was following the fight between Terence Crawford and Errol Spence, and how did Terence Bud Crawford stumble across becoming a boxer? He was a troublesome kid who was always fighting on the back streets, and they took him and they put him in boxing, and he's become pound for pound the best boxer in the world and making a lot of money while he's doing it.
Yeah.
And that's well, in my culture, and sometimes we fear that. I remember when my son was young and said, I want to play football. And I was like, no, 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 that's not on. I mean, you're not playing football. I
Too.
mean, and so we do it to ourselves, to other people. And so that whole sense of what other people think we should be rather than what we should be ourselves is important for us to deal with. Now, I found myself a stable computer now.
Civil quarter.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that as well, like just listening to what you were saying about, these mavericks and outliers is in our culture, in the Black culture, we don't really understand the need to take risks. So if you see a kid, different culture, they'll break something, and it's like, oh, okay, this is broken. Do you understand why it's broken? Do you see what you're trying to fix? Whatever. You do that in an African home, it's like big slap, right? And we don't understand that part of baking is breaking. And when you try to, like you're saying, like some of these kids, some of the brightest kids are the ones that are not going to look the brightest in the classroom. They've got natural leadership abilities, they've got a spirits, they're serious risk takers, but because we try to shove them into this box, we don't allow their true self, their true identity, their true worth to actually shine. And I feel like some of this is our with just the structure, but some of it is also the way we educate or the way we believe kids should be educated and what we believe is right or wrong, right? It's not just saying you broke this, you did this, or whatever. It's like allowing it's creating an environment where you can say like, well, you take a risk. Like you try to do this and it broke. And now what do we do? Rather than looking at just the breaking as the end game, but taking that breaking to be part of the journey. So I think a lot of the times we're not well prepared to take risk, and those of us that do fail, rather than people saying like, okay, that's fine, but you failed. It's you see, told you
Yeah, I
shouldn't have
agree.
done that. It's
I
a
agree.
big issue, big issue.
Yeah, yeah. Can I just speak into that slightly? Yeah,
Go
it's so
ahead.
important. It's important, as you say, that the whole context of how we view success and failure and the ability to take risks. I remember when I was, I had a study in my house, and I came back one day, and one of my um, felt pens, or ink pens, had been taken apart to pieces. And I have two sons, and I called Daniel, who was the younger. I said, Daniel, who did this? And I knew it was him. I didn't have to ask which one of them did it, because he was just naturally, and he didn't do it out of spite. He was curious as to whether,
Wow. Yeah.
how does this thing work? And I know that because I remember when I was young in school. I mean, as simple, as stupid as it sounded, I saw a tadpole we had a tank with tadpoles in it. And I thought to myself, I think I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I thought to myself, do tadpoles have blood in them? Do they bleed? You know, and so we stifle that creativity, as my sister rightly put there, by putting people in a box. This is the way you've got to think. This is what you've got to say. And creativity and exploring. And I say to ourselves, how often do you see people of our culture jumping out of the sky? To get the point, deciding that they're going
Nope.
skiing,
Yeah.
or exploring, mountain exploring. There's a risk in it. There's a risk of death. But if you don't take those inherent risks, you don't discover, is the context. And you don't live life to its fullest. And so and it's mental barriers and cultural barriers that impede or stop us then doing those things or living our lives to the uttermost, in those particular ways. I was talking to a gentleman yesterday who picked me up from someone when I traveled, and I said to him, I say from West Africa, but I go into East Africa. I go into Ethiopia, Rwanda, Burundi, and all that. And I said, they're great countries. I said, oh, well, we West Africans, we treat those countries the way the West Europeans treat Poland and Serbia and all those places. And I said, there's numerous opportunities there. And he said, oh, I need to get out and explore those countries. And so the word get out. I need to get out, and that whole context of how he thinks about other areas. And so the mental barriers that we have impede our progression, and we can only hope it's not too late then when we discover that we have these potentials and opportunities and possibilities that we didn't explore because of a particular way of thinking.
Yeah, I agree. And especially when you think about, like when you said you have like Steve Jobs and all these other people who take risks and take chances and drop out, and how certain things are okay for one culture, but it's not okay for another. I think about how we kind of train our kids, especially in the Black community. you know some of that is safety measures. Don't go here, don't drive at this time of night. You have to get an education. You can't do what other people do, because the rules are not necessarily the same. So because we know that the rules are not the same for people of color, then do we participate in planting those seeds of unworthiness or those limited belief systems in our kids, when we think, okay, we're just trying to keep you safe, but what parts of I want to keep you safe and I want to, educate you about how the world is, so that, we have to work 10 times as harder or 2 to 3 times as harder, or whatever the case may be. It's we're saying those things to our kids, because I said that to my son, you know, not going to college. You know, I used to say that's not an option, but then I
Mm,
started to say, you know what, I don't want to be like how my mom was and telling me the things that I can't do. I wanted to instead give him options. So I said, look, college is an option, 4-year university or a 2-year university. You want to learn what it is that you want to do. And I
mm,
know that, you know, my son is in digital animation. I knew that he loved to draw, and he hated school. He didn't like school. He would draw on everything. And the teachers would say he didn't do his homework, but on the back of it, boy, oh boy, did he create the most beautiful landscape I've ever seen
Mhm.
with all of these other things, right? And so understanding that when we plant those seeds of what you can't do and telling them what they should do, you know, consider the world that they're living in, but also consider how they're going to take the words that we say and carry it, and how that will manifest in their patterns and their behavioral habits and their choices and decisions to kind of, you know, you have a lot of people that tell their kids reach for the stars or reach for the moon and reach for all of these things. um, there's a level of guidance that needs to happen. I told my son, look, you have to work twice as hard, if not more than that, right? Because you're a Black man, right?
mm,
But it doesn't mean that you can't. You don't have as much room for error. So you have
mm,
to be very strategic, and you have to be consistent, and you have to put in lots of effort. And I don't want you to limit yourself with just one thing of what you can do. If you like to
mm,
draw, you know, you can be an architect. You can do renderings. You can do digital animation. You can be a children's book illustrator. There are all of these different types of things, because I don't want you to limit your mindset on just one thing. And I did kind of steer him out of sports just a little bit, because I think sometimes our society, when they look at Black boys, they immediately think, oh, they should play sports, right? But
mm,
pour certain seeds, like, you know, you can be an astronaut, you can be, you know, a world-renowned chef who
mm,
owns franchises full of restaurants. You can, you know, all of the different things you can do. You could be an engineer, certain types of engineers that you can, you know, think of. We limit them sometimes with what we've learned in life and what we've seen happen and be possible. But I think we as adults have to find new language as well, and
Yep.
unlock some of our own patterns,
mm,
and how we pour into the next generation, because we participate in some of the conditioning that we say we don't like, right?
mm.
With our kids, and sometimes we do it subconsciously. You guys agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know,
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's, you know, it's a hard balance because those things are true. You know, if you are a Black boy of a certain age, um, there are issues, right? These are all truths, but the question is, how do you balance? You know, I think you should always like, how do you prepare the child for the future?
yeah.
Mhm,
You know, how do you say this is true because of your gender, because
mhm,
of your color or whatever, but this does not define you. And I agree. I like what you said, like we've got to figure out some new language
mhm.
because you still have to tell the truth, right? You still have to say that problem exists.
Mm,
It's
Yeah,
the same thing for women. You have to say when you work, like if you work in certain industries, there still is an imbalance,
what
but
women
that's not your identity. And it's like you have to say both of them. You have to say what the facts are, but then you also have to kind of build the person and provide the person with the relevant tools, etc., to
Mhm.
know difference. And I you know, I remember this kind of funny story of this Indian girl in London. She was telling me how her parents moved straight from India to the UK, so you know, zero cultural awareness. And she was a kid, I think like 6 or 7, and they had swimming class, and her mom just gave her underwear because her mom had no, like, that's not a culture that you go swimming and put on a swimsuit and go with, you know. So she gets to the swimming class, and she said for till, you know, we were now in like, you know, like in our late 30s or whatever, and she was still traumatized. but the mom only did what she knew to do, and I feel like sometimes as parents, you can only do what you know to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's you're gonna put the kids in a awkward situation.
Hmm.
Sometimes you don't even know how to prepare that child, especially if your child is going into something that's completely different. Like if your child's gonna be an astronaut, I mean, how do you prepare that child? How
Yeah.
do you prepare a child to deal with the real issues? All you can say is, listen, you are Black. You need to make sure that you're not seen to be like, I'm always conscious about dressing, like the same way you talked about sports. I'm like, you cannot walk around looking like you're from a bad home, or you're a rapper, or you're whatever. And those are things that those are probably imbibed in me, because as soon as you walk in, you can look like a sex symbol if you're a Black woman. You can look provocative if you have a cleavage. You can look like a rapper if you decide as a guy that you're going to have baggy clothes. Somebody else can do that and they will be seen as a kid who is just wearing baggy clothes. But you do that as a Black person and you're immediately labeled. And then you're not taken seriously. And so unfortunately, those are the things that you have to say, as
Yeah.
well as saying
Yeah.
have to put those parameters down, because the world isn't fair and we're always going to be unfairly judged.
Right.
Just that.
We learned that at Spelman, of how to dress and how to carry yourself as a young lady and being sophisticated, because, you don't have the same privilege of being seen as a certain way. So I'm very, very mindful of not being looked at as a sex symbol, especially with the things that I've been through. I'm very mindful of what to show and how much to show and how not to show and how to carry myself and all of those things, especially in corporate America, or what it is that I wanted to be as a journalist and as a leader or as a role model, and so on and so forth. But I always wanted to make sure that I didn't set my child up to fail. Edward, how with your boys, right, because they're adults now, how did you navigate telling them how to grow up in the world without limiting what it is that they wanted to dream to be about, with the reality of living in the world as Black men?
Yeah, and I think that's very important, and I'm incredibly proud of the boys and who they are today. And I think that healthy balance was basically, as you were speaking, I was thinking about it, was one, letting them identify, be rooted in their culture. They know who they are. That's the first thing about those boys. They absolutely are aware and know that they are Black men. That first and foremost, they know not that they're just men, that they're Black men. They also are aware that as Black men, they have to, whether we like it or not, succeed twice as hard as
Mhm.
others. But then they are proudly rooted in their culture. They're proudly Nigerian. I mean, they were raised in England all their life. They were born and raised here. They traveled to Nigeria twice. But you ask them the sort of question that if Nigeria is playing against, and this is how I always try and test people's identity, is like, so if Nigeria is playing football against, or soccer as you would call it over there, against England, who would you support? Ah, no, Nigeria. I mean, they're absolutely sure, of who they are and their identity.
Mhm.
But then that whole context of letting them be was important to me. I can remember a particular time, Emmanuel, who was the older of the two, was about 4 or 5 years old, and I was driving around one day and had a very stressful day. And he was always asking why. Why this, dad? Why that, dad? Why this? Why that?
Mhm.
Why? How did I get on Earth? Why am I here? Just
Yeah.
even questions like that. And that day, I was just so exasperated with the day that I almost just told him, shut up. And something on the inside of me told me, it got to my throat, that if you tell him to shut up, he's never going to ask you why again.
Yeah.
He's never going to be able to ask you why or how or when again. And so that open channel of communication, of letting them be and ask all sorts of questions. I mean, there was a day in the back of the car and they asked this question. They said, Dad, and they debated it amidst themselves. They said, will Adam and Eve be in heaven or in hell?
It's a good question.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And
What?
so Yeah, I mean, they're 6 and 8 years old, and I can never forget that. But
Mm-hmm.
that whole idea of allowing them to keep on exploring and be who they are. We still do Father and Dad's Day. 2 weeks ago, we had the Father and Dad's Day in Nottingham, where they are now. We still do that. We go out, and the whole day is just us, and they continually explore and ask questions, and I let them be. So the whole idea of allowing the kid to explore, to be, they'll do silly things. They'll do silly. About what you said there, for example, Daniel, who's a younger, was a little bit more circumspect when it came to dressing. Emmanuel wanted to explore all these hoodies and pulling his trousers down and all
Mm-hmm.
those sort of things. You won't believe
That,
that the
oh
way
my God.
he dresses now. He's
Mm-hmm.
a real middle class guy now. But and so I said, listen, this is the compromise. You're going to be able to wear that hoodie when you're with your mum and I at that point in time, but you're not going to wear it when you're on your own anywhere. So if we go to the supermarket, if we go to the cinema, if we do that, then yeah, you're allowed to wear the hoodie, and but if you're on your own, no, because so
Mm-hmm.
and we accepted that
The
compromise.
perception. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, because obviously he's with us. I know that whatever perceptions people might have is different from when he's on his own or with his friends in that situation. So we reached a healthy compromise on it in a way until he outgrew it as a person. And
Right.
Naturally.
so
Yeah.
allowing them to be, but then putting kids need boundaries. People need boundaries in their life. We all need boundaries. We all work better with some degree, waking up in the morning, know what we're going to do, what our day is going to be, and structure in our lives. So that whole context of structure in their lives was important. But I remember Daniel coming back to me, works on the London Stock Exchange as a senior associate architecturist now, which is a strategist in cybersecurity consultancy. And he said, Dad, oh, when I got the job, I realized um, I was the token black man that they took.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to him, all my life, I've raised you and put you in circumstances and situations whereby you will feel comfortable in any environment being the only black man. And truly, when they went to private school, they were the only two black boys there in primary school then. And Dan Manuel came home saying, Dad, he was 6 years old. He didn't know concept of black and white. I said, why am I the only brown boy in school?
Mm.
So that context, and that really shaped them in a way, but they have this strong identity of culture of who
Yeah.
they are as black men, are comfortable in their skin, that we are black men. They used to crack this joke when they were younger teen, I don't know where they got it from. Where the older would tell younger, hurry across the road, we need to cross the road quickly, so there's not one less black man, one less. That's quickly. I think that, but that, and they were teenagers there, but they
They're
had
just proud. Yeah.
of them being in a like holding their own in a different society, and the fact that
Yeah.
was there, but then being confident in themselves. So, and I thought, how did these guys know that they're kind of outliers and that whole context of things? But
Right.
yeah,
Right. Well, I think too, like Ron said something in the comments, and he said, we when we give our children, especially like our Black young men and young girls, and we respond with statements like, all that's for white people, or we can't do that because we're not white.
Oh,
Certain things are not for us. Certain things that we can't do. One of the things that when it came to my son, is I didn't want to put limitations on the type of things that he can experience that are free for him to experience. Like, for example, my son is just like me, and I listen to film scores all the time. I love the orchestra. I love instruments. I love music. There's just so many things that, I didn't grow up listening to a lot of rap music. I grew up listening to like Elton John and Barbra Streisand and Chicago and Kenny Loggins and certain types of, music, and watching certain types of movies. And I was always told, oh, well, that's not really for you, or you're so odd, or you're so strange because you like certain things. And that's also conditioning too.
mm,
That's also saying you're not allowed to enjoy certain things or like certain things because, you should only be listening to that, or you should only like certain types of music, or you should only, because you grew up here, that you should only, this is what's acceptable. And I think that when it came to my son, I didn't limit him with the mindset of you should only listen to rap or you should only, I feel like you should experience everything that you can experience in the world.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't limit yourself or have a belief system that you can't enjoy the everyday things of life that you are free to enjoy, like traveling and seeing the world, the whole world, and opening up your mind to see that things are bigger than what it is that you grew up, and not punishing or judging or condemning him for wanting to skateboard or listen to film scores or watching. My son loves Japanese anime all the time.
Mhm.
And I didn't watch that a whole lot growing up, but he loves cartoons and certain things like that. And it's being okay that our kids like different things and letting them explore the world and expand their mindset bigger than our own. And just because we didn't do it or like it doesn't mean that they can't. Because again, it plays in the part of conditioned programming that comes through people like us, Bel, like you said, the people that love us the most sometimes say some of the worst things to us subconsciously or unknowingly, thinking that they're pouring in something good, but they are they are also adding to those limited belief systems of how we should experience the world, what we should like, what we should enjoy, the type of jobs and careers, and the type of stars we should aim for. Which, even though we live in a society as people of color, we need to break that mindset and reach for stars that everybody gets to reach for. It might be harder, and we might have to do a lot more work to reach up there and grab it, right? But if you have the village and the community, and the support that you can, you know what, that might not be something I saw growing up, but you can do it. You can be anything. You can, if you want to do the work and put in the necessary effort, and you recognize that it might be a little bit harder for you, but you still want to do it, I support that. I encourage that. Travel, see the world, experience life, but do it with a level of awareness so that you don't put yourself in harm's way, especially young Black women. Travel, but do it safe. Reach for the stars, but be mindful. Break the glass ceiling, right? But and do it in the way that enhances and encourages your authenticity. Does that
Yeah,
make sense? I
yeah.
think that would be a
Can,
great
can
way.
I can I just come in there again? I was thinking of, do you know Charlemagne? There's a gentleman in America called Charlemagne the God. He's a radio interview.
Presenter. Yeah.
Yeah, great young man like this, if I might call him that. And I remember listening. In fact, it was one of my sons that said, "Do I know him?" And I said, "Yeah, I just came across him a few weeks ago." It was and he said, Charlemagne the God said that his mother, when he was young, told him, "You know what? You can't get out of this environment that you're in, but for you to get out of this environment you're in, said read things that you would never read." Read things that you never read. And he said he started to read about white young girls through a particular author called Judy Blume.
Okay.
Mm.
Uh, and they had actually asked him. They asked him on the interview. I saw it and said, "Who would you like? Who would you most like to interview?" He said, "I would most like to interview Judy Blume." And eventually got to interview Judy Blume. And it reminds me when
Yeah.
I was young here in England, in my tier, I was surrounded by. I had two sisters, and one older and one younger. And so when they went to the library, they picked up Enid Blyton. She's kind of the British version of that, and they would come back with Famous Five, Secret Seven. Those were great books, series is, and then then she had books on girls um, in a school, and I would read those books. I mean, it was
Mhm.
all girls' books, but it was in the school things and things. So but when you engage with things, and then when I got to my teen years, I spent
Mhm.
my whole teen years reading Encyclopedia Britannica. My parents bought a whole box of that, and so holidays were spent reading that. And so
Same.
I used to tell my boys, I said to them, "You know what, sons?" I said, "You pay now, and you play later on. You play now and you'll pay later on. So pay now by putting your head down, becoming everything you want to be, and then play later on. A couple of weeks ago, I took them out for a meal in London, and they said, Dad, we're 28 and 30. We've both got our bachelors from great universities, and I'm working on my master's, and Daniel's in London Stock Exchange. When is the play coming? Because it seems like we're still paying. This, you know, this
Yeah.
whole concept, yeah. So the thing is kind of, but the key thing is the ability to, as Charlemagne the God said, you can be in an environment, but you can come out of that environment, and it's what you said that prompted me to this, where you said, travel the world, or that I said to the young man I spoke to yesterday, I said, in its truest essence, traveling is an education. I told him I've been to over 35 different countries, and
Mhm.
I've learned so much from traveling. Just traveling in itself is an archive of education in itself. And so, but does a person have to come out of an environment? Sometimes you can engage with books that that create imagination. And one of the things in our people is that we close down that realm of imagination of a child. A child comes and says, they sit in the kitchen, an imaginary kitchen. They bring their parents in, they make imaginary food, they
Mhm.
set it before you with imaginary tea, or they're
Mhm.
using an imaginary sword, pretending that they are Thor or whatever. And then the
Mhm.
parent says, shut up, no, you're not. You're gradually breaking down that aspect of the creativity or imagination
Yeah.
that enables them to explore, to become the cartoonists and the authors
Mhm.
and the inventors and the discoverers. And so often in our community, we cut down or we break down creativity. So
Yeah.
it's in such a way that we keep on creating clones, because the whole issue of a maverick, we don't want mavericks. We don't want, you know, uh, geniuses that are on the border of of thinking outside the box. It's like, where'd you get that from? Where did you get that idea from? I'll whoop you if that's coming from. But that's where
Mhm.
creativity comes from. And so I think it's important for us to realize that thinking outside the box, and a lot of these scientists and people who are, they consider them borderline. Some of them who got Nobel Peace Prizes and the Nobel, borderline, bizarre in their thinking. But
Right.
it's that bizarre thinking on the skirts of being bizarre that brings us to a new place of discovery.
I think that that's very true. And this is, this has been such a good conversation. We definitely have to do a part two, especially when it comes to our young people. But I think we lost Bel, but you know, moving forward when it comes to challenging those belief systems and just take time to do a little bit of mirror work, and I highly recommend self-assessing and catching some of the things that you think about,
Mhm.
catching some of the dialogue in the manner of which you speak to yourself, and how you are projecting your belief systems onto other people, and then asking yourself, do I believe these things that I'm saying to me? Why am I saying these things to myself? And if it's something that someone else has planted, those things have been planted into me. How can I unlearn those things, right? How can I change my environment? How can I change the circle of people around me? And how can I start choosing myself and believing that I am worthy of anything that is possible for anybody else, to understanding that those things are possible for me, and not speaking myself out of my blessings, not talking myself out of reaching for things that, you know, I believe that I deserve and that I'm worthy of. So, you know, that's a great way to kind of challenge those limiting belief systems and the conditioning, and understanding that, you know, just because other people didn't do it that I grew up around, right, doesn't mean that I can't do it. And I don't have to be anything and prove anything to anybody outside of God's mindset when it comes to me, you know.
Yeah,
And
that's
if
fantastic.
do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so I think that is one of the things that I definitely want to leave behind, for all of our viewers. Dr. Edward, is there anything that you want to leave, you know, last thing that you want to say to people who are watching, who have those limited mindsets?
Yeah, I just want to tell them the truest sense of uh, of of knowledge and wisdom is ultimately finding who you are as a person. There's always that cliche, and I'm not there when they say when God doesn't create copies, when you're someone else, you've left yourself. That's the best way of putting it. You've left who you should be, and you never want to get to the other end of life and think to yourself, "Wow, this is who I should have been,"
Mm-hmm.
you know. So fly, fly like a bird, discover, explore, do the ridiculous, do the stupid. You can only learn from it, you know. Call yourself an idiot sometimes when you don't do it, because out of that your creativity will come. But don't let anyone, not even yourself,
Mm-hmm.
hinder discovering who you should be and what you can do. There's no limit to that. There's no limits in possibilities for your life and who you can be when you go out to truly explore who you are, And so don't put any limits on yourself.
That is fantastic. And we're going to wrap on that note, guys. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you guys for thank you for staying with all of our technical issues and things like that. With, you have no control over technology and the internet. So until next time, you guys, remember to make sure that loving yourself first matters, and make sure that, when it comes to your mindset, that you pay attention to your thoughts out of love for yourself. And you should always think and see and speak and love yourself the way God does. Until next time, you guys, take care, and I'll see you soon. Stay safe. Bye, everybody.